Some men write about darkness. Others seem to carry it with them like a scent or a shadow. Edgar Allan Poe did both. He painted with gloom, sculpted sorrow into verse, and whispered horror so delicately that even nightmares leaned in to listen. But when he died, alone, delirious and whispering someone else's name, it was as though he had stepped directly into one of his own stories. And no one, not even now, is entirely sure what happened. Poe was born in 1809 in Boston, but his life rarely stayed still. Orphaned young, raised by foster parents in Virginia, he lived in a perpetual state of in-between, between families, between cities, between madness and meaning. From early on, his writing stood apart. He wrote of hearts that beat beneath floorboards, of lovers buried alive, of birds that whispered nevermore. He turned the grotesque into music and the terrifying into something oddly tender. But his own life was harder to shape. Poe struggled with poverty, with alcohol, with grief. He loved deeply but lost frequently. His wife, Virginia Clem, whom he married when she was just 13 and he was 27, died of tuberculosis in 1847. Her death shattered him. Many of his most haunting works, Annabel Lee the Raven, echo with her absence. By 1849, Poe was 40 years old and still a wandering figure on the literary fringe. He was planning to remarry. He had reconnected with a childhood sweetheart in Richmond. There were even signs of stability. And then he vanished. On September 27, 1849, Poe left Richmond, heading for Philadelphia. He was meant to edit a poetry collection, but he never arrived. For days, no one knew where he was. Then, on October 3rd, he was found, collapsed outside a tavern in Baltimore, delirious, dressed in someone else's clothes. The man who found him described Poe as in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. He was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he drifted in and out of consciousness. He could not explain what had happened. He called out for someone named Reynolds, a name unknown to his friends or family. He died on October 7th. His final words, according to some witnesses, were, "Lord, help my poor soul." And then he was gone. No death certificate survives. The official cause was listed as congestion of the brain, a vague 19th century euphemism that could mean nearly anything. Alcohol poisoning, infection, trauma. Theories have multiplied like ravens on a branch. Some say he drank himself to death. Others believe he was beaten or mugged. A darker theory suggests he was a victim of cooping, a voter fraud scheme where individuals were drugged, disguised, and forced to vote multiple times in elections. Baltimore at the time was notorious for such practices. Poe was found on Election Day. Then again, others speak of rabies, epilepsy, even diabetes complications. Still, no one knows for certain. Not where he had been, not why he was wearing another man's clothes, not what visions passed before his closing eyes. Even in death, Poe remained a puzzle. His funeral was tiny. Just a few mourners, no eulogies, a cold October day. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Years later, a proper stone was installed. His face carved in marble, his works canonized in every school. His influence would stretch through time like a long shadow, touching Lovecraft, Baudelaire, Hitchcock, and every child who's ever felt afraid in the dark. And yet the man remains elusive. Not just his death, but his life. Was he a romantic, a madman, a genius, a drunk? His enemies painted him as a wreck, his friends as a gentle soul, often misunderstood. The truth, like most things Poe touched, lies between those two candles, flickering and uncertain. Each year on his birthday, a mysterious visitor would leave a half bottle of cognac and 3 roses on his grave. The identity of this Poe toaster remains secret for decades. Even now, no one knows how or why the tradition began, or ended. It's the kind of detail he might have invented himself. So tonight, as the wind slides gently past your window, and the silence grows comfortably thick, think of Poe, not the legend, but the man, sitting by a candle, scribbling by hand, hearing the ticking of a clock as something more than time. Imagine him walking alone down a cobblestone street in Baltimore, coat too thin, eyes tired, carrying with him the weight of every poem he never finished. And let that image settle like dusk, because some stories don't have endings. They linger, they wait. They tap softly at the edge of memory, and Poe, even now, is still tapping. In an age when stars were still stitched to crystal spheres, when the sky was not merely observed but interpreted like sacred text, there lived a man who measured the heavens not with belief, but with math, precision, and the patience of one who knew how long it takes for light to whisper across the night. His name was Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman, an astronomer, and a character plucked straight from the pages of an old folio. Tycho was many things: eccentric, brilliant, stubborn, and by all accounts unforgettable. He had a golden nose. Let's begin there, shall we? In his youth, during a heated argument over mathematics, yes, mathematics, Tycho fought a duel with another noble student. The swords clashed, tempers flared, and Tycho lost a portion of his nose. For the rest of his life, he wore a prosthetic, reportedly made of gold, or perhaps a composite of brass and silver, fixed with a special adhesive paste. It became part of his legend. Along with his tame elk, his dwarf court jester, and his meticulous observations of the sky, Tycho lived during a crucial moment, between the ancient and the modern, when astrology still shared tables with astronomy. But he leaned firmly toward the scientific. With no telescope, none existed yet, he catalogued the positions of planets and stars more accurately than anyone before him. From his observatory, Uraniborg, on the Danish island of Fyn, he recorded celestial data for over 2 decades. His work would later be the foundation for Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which in turn paved the way for Newton's understanding of gravity. He bridged the stars and the science of falling apples. But even the man who mapped the heavens could not avoid the small humiliations of mortality. In 1601, Tycho Brahe attended a royal banquet in Prague. It was grand, gilded, and steeped in etiquette. At the table, custom demanded that no one rise before the host, even for nature's call. Tycho, ever the gentleman, did not excuse himself. He held it too long, and as strange as it sounds, that decision may have killed him. Later that evening, he experienced immense pain, likely a ruptured bladder or urinary tract infection, made worse by internal pressure and infection. He fell ill. For days he suffered, slipping in and out of agony, unable to urinate, fevered and weakening. His last recorded words were, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain." He died on October 24th, 1601, at age 54, and with him died the last great naked eye, astronomer. But like all things touched by time and stardust, his death invited more questions. Centuries later, whispers grew louder. Was it really a bladder issue? Some believed he was poisoned, possibly with mercury. In 2010, his body was exhumed from its tomb in Prague. Tests were done. Scientists searched his bones, his hair, his tissues for answers. The result? Inconclusive. There were traces of mercury, but not enough to suggest murder. Perhaps it really was the banquet, the etiquette, the momentary choice that, in its restraint, sealed his fate. There's something almost poetic in it. The man who charted celestial orbits to within fractions of degrees, who caught comets before they vanished and measured the angles of planetary paths, was undone not by disease, not by rival, but by silence, by sitting still, by waiting politely. And yet he did not die in vain. His observations, thousands upon thousands of data points, would become the blueprint for a revolution in our understanding of space. He did not know how planets moved, but he measured how they appeared to move and gave Kepler the tools to unlock their secrets. So what do we make of Tycho? A scientist in a silk robe, a nobleman with a golden nose, a man who believed the universe could be known, not by faith but by patient watching. He reminds us that knowledge is not born in thunder, but in steady eyes, quiet nights, and a refusal to guess when one can measure. Tonight, as your world darkens and the stars return to their ancient posts above your rooftop, think of Tycho Brahe, not in a laboratory, not in a duel, but seated at a grand table filled with laughter, wine, and candlelight, holding back for just a little too long, and later, lying in bed, whispering not of regrets, but of legacy. Let me not seem to have lived in vain. And he didn't. Each satellite that orbits today, each probe that slips past Jupiter, each child who looks up and names a star, that's Tycho still watching. So rest now under skies he helped map. Let the silence deepen, let your breath slow, for even the astronomers must sleep, and even stars must blink. In the young heartbeat of a new nation, when the ink on its constitution was still drying and its skyline was more sail than stone, there walked a man who lived as if every moment might be the one that defined him. His name was Alexander Hamilton, statesman, soldier, visionary, and, in the end, a man who could not let go of a single insult. He was born in 1755, or perhaps 1757, in the Caribbean, on the island of Nevis. Illegitimate, impoverished, and orphaned young, Hamilton grew up with little more than books and ambition. But he read fiercely, wrote fluently, and saw no reason why he shouldn't change the world. And change it he did. He fought in the American Revolution, rose to George Washington's side, and later became the first Secretary of the Treasury. He designed the financial systems that would help turn 13 rebellious colonies into a nation. He founded the Coast Guard, the Bank of the United States, and a newspaper or two along the way. His mind moved like a river, quick, determined, always seeking a path forward. But Hamilton also had an edge, a pride sharp enough to cut, a temper that smoldered. He made enemies as easily as he drafted economic policy, none more enduring than Aaron Burr. Burr was a fellow revolutionary, a lawyer, a man of grace and ambition. But where Hamilton was theory and thunder, Burr was silence and strategy. They had once been cordial, even respectful, but politics sharpened their distance. By 1804, their rivalry had reached its breaking point. That summer, Hamilton made a remark, perhaps casual, perhaps not, questioning Burr's character at a dinner party. Burr, then the sitting vice president of the United States, demanded an explanation. Letters flew between them, heavy with formality and fire. No apology came. So Burr issued a challenge, a duel. It was July 11th, 1804. Dawn. The banks of the Hudson River at Weehawken, New Jersey. A place chosen in part because dueling was illegal in New York. They stood 10 paces apart. Pistols loaded. Seconds watching. The air damp with river mist and early summer heat. Now history bends here. Accounts differ. Some say Hamilton intended to fire wide, an act of honor, a protest against the duel itself. Others believe he aimed to win. Burr, calm and precise, took his shot. The bullet struck Hamilton just above the right hip, shattering his liver, lodging near his spine. He fell. Carried back across the river, he lingered for over 24 hours in agony. Friends, family, political allies, many came to his bedside. His wife, Eliza, held his hand. He asked for forgiveness, for mercy, for dignity. He died on July 12th, at the age of either 47 or 49, depending on which birth year you believe. Burr's shot did not just end a life, it sent ripples through the young nation. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though neither case went to trial. His political career collapsed. He wandered in disgrace, later facing treason charges, living long after but never again holding power. As for Hamilton, his death became legend. His funeral was grand. Black crepe and cannon fire. His children wore mourning bands for years. Eliza, widowed with 7 surviving children, spent the next 5 decades preserving his legacy. She founded orphanages, collected. His writings told his story again and again. Today, his face appears on the $10 bill. His words echo in government chambers. His story, once reserved for scholars, now dances in song and theater. But let us turn down the lights. Let us slow the applause. Hamilton's death was not just a loss to a nation. It was the silencing of a mind that had always moved too fast, spoken too boldly, and loved his country too fiercely to keep quiet. He lived as if running out of time. He wrote as if the future were watching. And in that final moment, pistol in hand, river below, honor ahead, he stepped into a space few of us understand, where principle and pride collide. So tonight, as you rest your head and listen to the stillness of your own quiet room, think not of the duel or the drama. Think of the boy who once wrote his way off an island, the man who built systems out of smoke and hope, the husband who held Eliza's hand and asked her to remember, and let his story remind you, not of death, but of legacy. For sometimes the sharpest minds leave us early, but their ideas, like letters folded into pockets, keep unfolding long after they're gone. Sleep now. Let the river be calm. The pistols are silent. And history, at last, is still. There are performers, and then there are forces of nature. Elvis Presley was both. He didn't just sing, he shimmered. On stage, he moved like a storm in silk, hips defying gravity, voice melting like butter on hot vinyl. He was simply the king, not by coronation, but by something deeper, stranger, more electric. And yet, for all his fame, Elvis died not in the roar of applause, but in the hush of a bathroom. Quietly, alone, with no encore. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935, a twin, though his brother was stillborn. Raised poor, humble, and deeply religious, Elvis grew up with gospel in his ears and rhythm in his bones. The moment he found a guitar, the rest was destiny pressing the record button. In 1954, he recorded with Sun Records. The result, That's All Right, cracked the silence of American music like thunder. A young man with jet black hair and a voice that bent genres had arrived. The world did not take long to notice. By the late 1950s, Elvis was a phenomenon. Women screamed, parents frowned, cameras strained to keep up with his hips. He wasn't just a singer. He was the sound of rebellion, of youth, of something new. He went to Hollywood, made films, served in the army, came back to more gold records. He married Priscilla, had a daughter, Lisa Marie. The voice stayed strong, the sideburns grew thicker, the jumpsuits shinier. But beneath the rhinestones, something was slipping. The pressures of fame, the demands of a grueling schedule, and the isolation that comes with being worshipped. These things began to weigh heavily. Elvis, once lean and restless, became heavier in both body and spirit. His diet shifted to excess. His inner circle, dubbed the Memphis Mafia, protected him, enabled him, insulated him. By the 1970s, the world still loved him, but he looked tired, bloated, like a man wearing the costume of his own past. He performed constantly, often barely rested, occasionally barely coherent. There were nights when the king forgot lyrics, others when he dazzled still. The audience never stopped loving him, but some began to wonder if they were watching an echo. Behind the scenes, Elvis struggled with addiction, prescription drugs, painkillers, sleeping pills, stimulants, kept his days together like glue. His health declined, his moods darkened. His appetite swelled, yet he kept going, touring, recording, smiling, until he didn't. On the morning of August 16, 1977, at Graceland, his sprawling, eccentric mansion in Memphis, Elvis did not come down for the day. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, found him slumped on the bathroom floor. He had suffered a cardiac arrest. At 42 years old, Elvis Presley was dead. The world shook. Radio stations paused their playlists. Fans collapsed in grief. News anchors choked on their own voices. It didn't feel real. It still doesn't. The official cause of death was heart failure, though toxicology reports suggested his system was flooded with prescription medications. Over time, the precise details blurred beneath layers of grief, controversy, and denial. Some refused to believe he was truly gone. Rumors bloomed. Sightings in gas stations, a man boarding a plane with familiar sideburns, Elvis working at a diner in Michigan. Conspiracy theories whispered that the king had faked his death to escape fame, but the truth was far more ordinary and far more tragic. He had died not because he wanted to vanish, but because he had been consumed by expectation, by fame, by the machinery of myth. Graceland became a shrine. Fans still line its gates, candles in hand, songs in heart. His home is now one of the most visited private residences in America. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, a vigil of light gathers, soft, flickering, faithful, and what remains of Elvis? Not just a name, not just a voice, but a presence. His influence can be heard in nearly every genre: rock, pop, country, soul. He bridged racial divides in music, brought gospel to radio, turned rhythm into revolution. He made space for swagger, for sincerity, for sadness behind sunglasses. And in his quieter songs, the aching ballads, the gospel hymns, you can still hear the boy from Tupelo, not the king, just the voice, soft, searching, human. So tonight, as you dim the lights and the air grows still, imagine a stage. Empty now. Curtains swaying slightly. And somewhere in the wings, a figure in white, watching, not returning, just remembering. The king has left the building. But the music, it's still playing. In a city of marble columns and sunlit courtyards where democracy was young and ideas were traded like coin, lived a man who asked questions no one wanted to answer. His name was Socrates, and when he died, by choice, by law, by hemlock, it was not a tragedy, but a strange, radiant kind of peace. A philosopher's farewell not to life but to misunderstanding. Socrates left behind no scrolls, no signed works. What we know of him comes from his students, chiefly Plato, who wrote of his teacher with reverence, awe, and a sense of mystery. To Plato, Socrates was a gadfly, a stinging presence that kept Athens awake. He wandered the agora barefoot, robe unkempt, beard tangled with thought. He did not lecture. He questioned. Always. What is justice? What is beauty? What? Do you know, really? He made the powerful uncomfortable, the young curious, and the city suspicious. His enemies said he corrupted the youth, that he denied the gods, that his questions were daggers cloaked in smiles. In 399 BCE, he was brought to trial. The charges: impiety and corrupting the minds of the young. His defense? A calm, unwavering explanation that he had done nothing but seek truth. That his questions, though irritating, were necessary. That he was, in a sense, a gift from the gods. It didn't work. A jury of his peers, 500 Athenian citizens, found him guilty. He was offered options: exile, silence, retraction. He refused. So they sentenced him to death. By hemlock, a poison made from the conium plant. Silent, inevitable. And here, in the quiet shade of an Athenian prison, unfolds one of the most remarkable deaths in recorded history. Plato, in his dialogue, Phaedo, recounts the last hours. Friends and students gathered. In Socrates' cell, the philosopher was calm, not tearful, not angry, but curious. They spoke not of farewells, but of the soul. What happens after death? Is the soul immortal? Can wisdom survive the flesh? Socrates did not preach. He asked. He listened. He argued gently. His voice was not raised but steady, like a stream guiding its listeners past fear. As sunset approached, The jailer brought the cup of poison. Socrates took it without trembling. No one restrained him. No one begged. He raised the cup, toasted to the gods, and drank. No drama, no lament. Just an old man with clear eyes, walking into the unknown as if it were a garden. As the poison spread, his limbs grew cold. Numbness rose from his feet to his chest. He lay down as instructed and spoke his final words. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt. And then he stopped breathing. A small sentence, but dense with meaning. Asclepius was the god of healing. In that moment, Socrates was saying, death is not a punishment, it is a cure. A release from the illusions of the world, the noise of the marketplace, the heavy robes of opinion. His death was not a defeat. It was a final argument. Even as his body failed, his mind held steady. Even in silence, he was still teaching. Athens would later regret its decision. Statues were raised. Apologies made. His name became sacred. His dialogues required reading for generations of thinkers. Socrates, who claimed to know nothing, became the root of all Western philosophy. But tonight, in the hush of your own thoughts, forget the legacy. Forget the textbooks and syllogisms. Think instead of the stone floor beneath him, the sunlight dimming through a narrow window, the friends who watched him, not with horror, but with awe. Think of the stillness, the absence of fear, the surrender that felt somehow like victory. Let that image carry you into rest. For some men do not rage against the dying of the light. They greet it, they ask its name, and then they smile. There are certain people who do not walk across history. They soar. Amelia Earhart was one of them. Pilot, poet, pioneer. She chased the horizon not because it was safe, but because it was there. She slipped between clouds with a smile and made the impossible feel like a matter of fuel and faith. And when she vanished, it was not with fear, but with the same grace and mystery she had always carried. She was born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. A tomboy, a dreamer. She built ramps to fly off the roof of her childhood home, read books about daring women, drove cars fast and made friends of the wind. At a time when women were expected to be still, Amelia chose movement. Flying came later. A 10-minute ride in a small plane in 1920. 10 minutes that changed everything. As soon as we left the ground, she said, I knew I had to fly. And so she did. She bought a yellow biplane, nicknamed it the Canary, and set altitude records before she was 30. In 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She flew from Newfoundland to Ireland in 15 hours. Tossed by storms, soaked in fuel, soaked in history, the world applauded. But Amelia didn't fly for fame. She flew for the quiet joy of it, the view, the challenge, the feeling that nothing was impossible if you didn't stop moving. By the late 1930s, she had done nearly everything: record-breaking flights, best-selling books, lectures that filled auditoriums. She was a symbol of modern womanhood, independent, fearless, thoughtful. But she wanted one final adventure, to circle the globe. It would be the longest flight ever attempted, around the equator, nearly 29,000 miles. She would use a Lockheed Electra, modified for long-range flight. With her was navigator Fred Noonan, an experienced seaman and pilot. They departed from Oakland, California, in May 1937. The world watched. Newspapers printed each stop: Brazil, Senegal, India, Singapore, Australia, New Guinea. Then came July 2nd, 1937. They were en route to Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the Pacific, 2,556 miles from Lae, New Guinea. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter, Itasca, waited near the island to guide them in, but something went wrong. Radio transmissions grew strained, then scattered. Amelia's voice crackled. She reported low fuel, cloud cover, trouble locating the island. We are on the line, 157, 337. We are running north and south. And then, nothing. Silence. She and Noonan had disappeared. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in history. Battleships, planes, crews scoured the Pacific. No trace, no wreckage, no signal. The sky that had once carried her so far now seemed to have swallowed her whole. The world grieved, but it also wondered, where had she gone? Theories bloomed like constellations. Some said she crashed into the ocean, the Electra sinking beneath the waves. Others believed she landed on an uninhabited island and perished there. A few whispered of espionage, that she had been captured by the Japanese or assumed a secret identity. Books were written, expeditions launched, clues surfaced, bones, scraps of aluminum, old rumors, but none confirmed her fate. Amelia had become more than a pilot. She was now a mystery. And maybe that, too, was fitting, for Amelia was never meant to be pinned down. She belonged to wind and wide skies, to open runways and distant ridgelines. She once said, "The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity," and in that spirit, she left behind not just records or riddles, but a kind of courage that never quite lands. Now her name is a winged whisper in classrooms, in history books, in hangars and museums. Little girls still dress as her for school projects. Seasoned pilots still nod at her legacy. Somewhere, high above the Pacific, the sky remembers her. So tonight, as you rest your head and listen to the hum of your own quiet world, imagine the final moments of Amelia Earhart, not as loss, but as flight. A silver plane gliding over endless blue, a horizon that never comes closer, a voice speaking into the clouds, steady and clear. And then, peace. No crash, no panic, just sky. For some people, do not vanish. They ascend. They become the thing they loved most. And Amelia? She became the air itself. There are queens who wear crowns, and there are queens who are the crown, whose presence is so steeped in power and myth that gold and jewels seem redundant. Cleopatra VII of Egypt was one such queen, and when she died, it was not with a scream, nor in chains. It was with dignity, silence, and a kind of theatrical stillness that echoed longer than any empire. She was the last pharaoh, the last light of a line stretching back 3,000 years. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. Though foreign by blood, she embraced Egyptian language, culture, and ritual in a way her ancestors had not. She did not merely reign over Egypt, she embodied it. When she took the throne, Egypt was already in the long shadow of Rome. The Republic was expanding, and her kingdom, rich in grain and gold, was both prize and pawn. Cleopatra, brilliant and fluent in many languages, understood the game. She played it not with armies but with presence. Her alliance, political and romantic, with Julius Caesar brought her stability, a son, and years of relative power. After Caesar's assassination, she aligned with Mark Antony. Together, they shared not just affection but ambition. They dreamed of a new empire, Roman, Egyptian, Eastern, but dreams, especially imperial ones, attract enemies. Rome turned against them. Octavian, soon to be Augustus Caesar, rose as their rival. The tide shifted, battles were lost, fleets burned. The legend of Antony and Cleopatra unraveled not in one moment, but in a slow, elegant collapse. In 30 BCE, as Roman forces entered Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra knew their fates were sealed. Antony, misled by rumors of Cleopatra's death, fell on his own sword. He did not die instantly. Instead, he was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he bled in her arms, gasping apologies and regrets. His death was a tragedy. Hers would be a statement. Cleopatra had herself sealed inside the mausoleum. Surrounded by her treasures, her handmaidens, and the last emblems of a dying kingdom, she prepared to leave the world not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Octavian wanted her alive, for parading, for propaganda. She refused. She had no interest in being dragged through Roman streets as a chained relic, so she chose her exit. The details are blurred by time and poetry. Some say she applied a poison to her skin. Others speak of a venomous asp, smuggled in a basket of figs hidden until the moment was right. What is certain is this: she died on her own terms. Her servants, Iris and Charmian, died beside her. When Octavian's men broke in, it was already done. Cleopatra lay serene, dressed in royal robes, her crown near, her handmaidens at her side. She was 39 years old. With her death, Egypt fell. Rome took the Nile. The temples fell silent. The gods grew quiet. The age of pharaohs ended not with a revolution, but with a whisper behind stone doors. And yet, Cleopatra did not vanish. She rose in myth. She became symbol. Painters, poets, playwrights, emperors, they all reimagined her. She was seductress, strategist, traitor, goddess. Her image changed with the needs of each century. But perhaps the truth is simpler. She was a woman born into power, taught to survive, and determined to rule. She loved fiercely. She lost slowly. She died deliberately. And tonight, as you lie in the hush of your own room with the weight of quiet pressing gently against your breath, think of Cleopatra. Not the legend, not the caricature, but the woman. Alone in her mausoleum. A kingdom behind her. A future beyond her. Choosing silence over spectacle. Think of the coolness of the stone, the faint scent of oils, the flicker of a dying lamp. And then nothing. No applause. No audience. Just a queen exiting history with the grace of someone who knows her story is far from over. Sleep now. The crown is at rest, in the cool, salted air of the North Atlantic, where the Orkney Islands cling to the edge of Scotland like a cluster of brooches fastened by wind and legend, lived a man who would become both feared and faintly ridiculous. His name was Sigurd, Eysteinsson, though he would become known, both fondly and not, as Sigurd the Mighty. A Viking of no small ambition, he governed the Isles during the 9th century with a blade in one hand and a reputation in the other. But if you ask history, what finally felled him, it will shrug gently and whisper something quite absurd. Yes, Sigurd the Mighty died of a tooth, but that is to rush ahead. As with all good tales told under blankets and drifting into dreams, we must begin where the fog is thick, the mead is warm, and the horses wear names longer than their owners. Sigurd was not born into obscurity. The Norse had a habit of recording their lineage as if recounting poetry with a sword. His father, Eystein Glumra, carried a name that translates roughly as Eystein the Noisy, which might suggest that Sigurd inherited more than a crown, perhaps a certain flair for dramatic exits as well. Sigurd rose to power in Orkney, likely through a mix of axe-wielding and strategic marriage, though the sagas remain politely vague on which came first. He ruled the Orkneys with confidence, launching raids along the Scottish coast, raiding villages, and no doubt engaging in the kind of light plundering that kept Viking morale high and local peasants nervous. Yet, for all his campaigns, his most memorable conflict would not be against armies, but against one particular man with one particularly memorable dental arrangement. Enter Mal Bright, a Pictish nobleman with an unfortunate moniker, the Bucktoothed. Now medieval nicknames rarely flattered. There was Ivar the Boneless, Eric Bloodaxe, and of course, Bricte the Bucktoothed. Whether the man's teeth jutted like the prow of a longship or merely stood out in gossip, we cannot say. But what we do know is that Bricte became Sigurd's adversary in a bitter territorial dispute. They arranged to meet in single combat, each bringing 40 men. Honorable terms as far as Vikings and Picts go. But Sigurd, ever the strategist, or perhaps just not very good at counting, brought 80. The battle was short. Brecht was defeated, beheaded, and his 40 warriors cut down. History recorded the event with little sympathy and much admiration for Sigurd's efficiency. But here is where the tale begins to tip its horn into the bizarre. Pleased with his victory, Sigurd ordered Brake's head to be fastened to his saddle, as a trophy. Perhaps he planned to ride back triumphantly, the head swaying with each trot, proclaiming, "Here is my conquest." A grim accessory, to be sure, but not uncommon in an age where souvenirs often had teeth. And teeth, dear listener, are where this tale finds its dark, humorous twist. As Sigurd rode home, galloping through heather and sea-sprayed moor, Brida's head jostled on the saddle. Whether the head was tied too low or Sigurd leaned too close, one of Brake's prominent buck teeth grazed the Viking's leg. Just a scratch. A prick, even. Barely worth mention. But in the 9th century, where wounds festered like gossip and medicine involved chanting or honey, that scratch soon became an infection. Within days, the once mighty Sigurd lay dying from the bite of a man who was already dead. A ghostly chuckle, perhaps, echoed across the fields. The sagas are sparse on the exact manner of his decline, whether he raged, wept, or cursed dentistry for all eternity. But what remains certain is that Sigurd Eysteinsson, Earl of Orkney, conqueror, and mighty Viking lord, was defeated not by sword, not by siege, but by a posthumous nibble. Now let us drift, you and I, into the soft folds of reflection. What lessons lie curled within this strange demise? That pride precedes the fall? That overkill carries consequences? Or perhaps, more gently, that fate has a sense of humor, and even in history, irony has teeth. Sigurd's tale has endured, not for his battles or conquests, but for this almost comical end. His name floats through classrooms and campfires alike, a reminder that even those who towered above others can stumble on the smallest stone, or tooth, in this case. So tonight, as you pull the blankets close and listen to the rain tap against your window, imagine the Orkneys in twilight. Picture a mighty Viking, proud and foolish, galloping with a grisly trophy at his side, unaware that his last great act was already in motion. And let yourself smile, just a little, at the oddness of it all. For in the vast library of history, some pages rustle not with battles, but with the soft laughter of fate's quiet joke. Some stories in history drift gently like falling leaves, soft, quiet, tinged with melancholy. Others sparkle like morning dew on a lion's mane, bold and strange, impossible to ignore. And then there are stories like that of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor who once ruled like a fever dream stitched into a silk robe. In the early 3rd century, Rome was no stranger to eccentric emperors. But Elagabalus, whose reign lasted barely 4 years from 218 to 222 CE, did not merely toe the line of imperial oddity, he danced over it in embroidered slippers. Historians describe his rule as scandalous, indulgent, and thoroughly confusing. Yet beneath the lavish banquets and whispered rumors of orgies lay a person both tragic and unknowable, caught between identity, empire, and expectations that no velvet rope could protect him from. Elagabalus was born, Varius Avitus Bassianus, in the sun-scorched city of Emesa in modern-day Syria. There his family held religious authority, serving as high priests to the deity Elagabal, a sun god whose worship would soon travel all the way to Rome. It's from this god that young Bassianus would take his imperial name, Elagabalus. At just 14 years old, through a whirlwind of court intrigue and manipulation by his powerful grandmother Julia Maesa, Elagabalus was placed on the throne of Rome. Imagine for a moment being a teenager suddenly declared divine and supreme ruler over millions with temples at your disposal and senators bowing in marble halls. It is perhaps not surprising that things quickly became unconventional. Elagabalus brought with him not just new gods, but a whole new vision of Rome's sacred hierarchy. He insisted that Elagabal, the eastern sun deity, be worshipped above Jupiter himself, the Roman king of gods. A bold move. He even had a massive black meteorite symbolizing the deity, transported to Rome and installed in a lavish temple. The people were puzzled. The Senate was insulted, and the priests, well, they probably broke into nervous sweats. But what truly scandalized Roman society wasn't merely his religious overhaul, It was the emperor himself. Elagabalus blurred lines in a world that liked its roles sharply drawn. He reportedly dressed in women's clothing, wore makeup, and preferred to be addressed as a lady rather than a lord. Contemporary sources, many of them hostile, claimed he offered vast sums of money to any physician who could perform gender reassignment surgery, an idea so startlingly modern that it leaves even historians blinking. Now, we must tread gently. Here, for ancient sources were quick to turn difference into outrage, and much of what we know is wrapped in bias and embellishment. But beneath their venom lies the portrait of a ruler exploring identity in a society unprepared to understand it. Of course, this being imperial Rome, there was also spectacle. Elagabalus was said to release exotic animals into banquet halls for dramatic effect. He reportedly smothered guests in rose petals, not romantically, but to the point of suffocation. He dined on hummingbirds' tongues, invited prostitutes to dinner, and is rumored to have appointed a chariot driver as a consul. Each tale more theatrical than the last, as if the emperor was directing a grand play where the audience grew more confused with each act. But as you may already suspect, such performances rarely end with applause. By the time Elagabalus turned 18, discontent had brewed into danger. The soldiers who once raised him to power now muttered in armored corners. The Senate, already fraying under his disregard, longed for the stability of tradition. Even his own family began to shift alliances. In particular, his grandmother, the very architect of his rise, began to favor his more conventional cousin, Severus Alexander. It all came to a quiet yet bloody end. In 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers and often kingmakers, moved decisively. Elagabalus and his mother were summoned to the barracks under false pretenses. There, far from the velvet and perfume of the palace, they were executed. Their bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped of imperial dignity. Elagabalus was tossed into the Tiber as if the river might wash away memory itself. But it didn't. Elagabalus's name was struck from monuments, his likeness destroyed, and the records purged where possible. It was damnatio memoriae, a formal erasure from history, and yet history is a poor eraser. Whispers remain, carried like wind over the 7 hills, persistent and strange. So what do we make of Elagabalus? A reckless tyrant? A misunderstood youth? A proto-revolutionary in silk? Perhaps none. Perhaps all. History seldom allows its characters to be simple. What remains is a story shimmering with contradiction. A teenager crowned a god, drowned by tradition and remembered in scandal. Tonight, as the hush of night grows deeper and your breath slows, consider this. Elagabalus lived not just in defiance of Rome, but of the very mold from which emperors were cast. In a world that demanded conformity, he wore lace. In a city of marble, he dreamed of stars and meteorites. And while his reign was brief, it flickered with an eccentric light that refuses to be entirely extinguished. Rest now, with that glow in mind, for even the strangest flames leave their trace on the dark. In the bustling heart of ancient Greece, where marble statues watched over olive markets and philosophers argued beneath fig trees, there lived a man so unusual, so entirely unfazed by convention, that even death itself would become part of his final joke. His name was Diogenes of Sinope, and he made a career out of being disagreeable in the most delightful way. Now, Diogenes wasn't your average toga-clad thinker. He didn't teach in academies or write volumes of theory. In fact, he disdained books almost as much as he disdained shoes. He lived in a large clay jar, often mistakenly called a barrel, and made it his mission to expose the absurdity of polite society. While other philosophers debated ethics in clean robes, Diogenes would stroll through the marketplace in broad daylight holding a lantern. When asked what he was doing, he'd say, "I am looking for an honest man." He never found one, of course, but the statement alone was enough to cause small philosophical fires in the minds of passers-by. He was the founder of cynicism, a school of thought that believed virtue was best expressed through living simply, rejecting material wealth and mocking social pretensions. And Diogenes, like a barefoot Socrates with a grudge, practiced what he preached, usually loudly and with a touch of theatrical flair. There are many stories about him, each stranger than the last. Once, when Plato described man as a featherless biped, Diogenes famously plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, shouting, "Behold Plato's man." The incident forced Plato to revise the definition, adding the clause, "with broad, flat nails." Another time, Alexander the Great, the world's most powerful man, came to visit him. Most philosophers would have quivered in their sandals, but Diogenes, he was sunbathing. When Alexander asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes didn't hesitate. "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The reply reportedly stunned the conqueror, and to his credit, Alexander said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Not everyone shared the sentiment. Diogenes was mocked, avoided, occasionally beaten, and always talked about. Children mimicked his antics, adults grumbled, but few could ignore him. He was a man determined to live truthfully, even if that truth was uncomfortable, crude, or smelled faintly of fish. But even a life lived without property, status, or socks must one day come to its end. And fittingly, the manner of Diogenes's death is as disputed and strange as the rest of his life. Some say he died from eating raw octopus. Others claim he held his breath out of boredom. One version insists he was bitten by a dog, a poetic finish for a philosopher who often likened humans to canines. But perhaps the most enduring version is the one that simply says, he lay down in the sun one day, stretched out like a cat on a windowsill, and quietly slipped away. No drama, no final lecture, just a peaceful fade like the closing of a philosophical eye. And what of his legacy? Diogenes left behind no writings, no disciples to carry his torch in scrolls. But his spirit, irreverent, clear-eyed, and utterly unbothered, has drifted down the centuries like a dry leaf with opinions. Modern minimalists might nod in admiration. Comedians would recognize a fellow trickster, and those who've grown, weary of pretension, bureaucracy, and the thousand small lies of civilized life, they might find in Diogenes a strange kind of hero. Tonight, as you settle into your pillow and the world grows dim, consider this man who made a philosophy out of defiance and a lifestyle out of provocation. Imagine him in his ceramic dwelling, muttering at pigeons, ignoring philosophers, laughing at kings, and then imagine the day he decided to leave, as quietly as he came. No speeches, no sorrow, just the setting sun, the scent of summer, and perhaps one last smirk. For Diogenes, even death was a game he refused to play by the rules. Rest now. Let the world spin with all its seriousness and structure, while you drift into dreams with the soft reminder. Sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is simply not take it all so seriously. In the snowy silence of 18th century Sweden, where candles flickered against dark pine walls and snow piled thick along cobbled streets, there reigned a king who loved a good meal. Not just appreciated, loved with the devotion of a poet to a sonnet or a cat to a warm windowsill. His name was Adolf Fredrik, King of Sweden from 1751 to 1771. He was a monarch of mild temperament, more suited to parchment and pudding than politics and war. Though his reign was marked by limited political power, his role mostly ceremonial under Sweden's constitutional monarchy, he still enjoyed the trappings of royalty: velvet cloaks, gilded teacups, and above all, dessert. Which brings us to a cold day in February of 1771, and a dinner that would go down in history not for its menu but for its outcome. Now let us pause here, dear listener. This story is not one of sword or scandal. It is a tale of spoons, stomachs, and the deeply human folly of just one more bite. Adolf Fredrik had always enjoyed his food. He was known to tinker with recipes, to summon chefs for late-night suppers, and to insist upon the presence of sweet treats at every royal meal. But on Shrove Tuesday, a traditional feast day before the Lenten fast, He took indulgence to an imperial level. That evening, the royal table groaned under the weight of delicacies. There were platters of lobster, rich and steaming, glistening, with clarified butter. There were meats, roast beef, sausages, and salted herring, each more seasoned than the last. Cabbage stewed in vinegar, turnips caramelized to near confection. And amidst it all, towering bowls of surströmming, the infamous fermented herring of Sweden, perfumed with a scent that could awaken ancient Viking ghosts. The king ate heartily, cheerfully, with the joyful abandon of a man unconcerned with moderation, and then came dessert. It is here that the story finds its most legendary detail, the semla. A semla, for those unacquainted, is a humble yet glorious pastry. A cardamom-spiced bun filled with almond paste and crowned with whipped cream. It is the kind of treat that inspires both poetry and indigestion. Adolf Frederick did not eat one semla, nor two, not even 4. He ate 14. Yes, 14 fluffy, cream-laden buns, following a meal already fit for 3 armies and a battalion of royal hounds. One imagines him reclining afterward, hands on his royal belly, sighing contentedly, or perhaps hiccuping in minor distress. What is certain is that later that night, the king suffered severe digestive problems, specifically a fatal case of indigestion. He passed away shortly thereafter, leaving behind a kingdom, a family, and a cautionary tale that would echo through kitchens and classrooms alike. Officially, the cause of death was listed as a surfeit of food. But unofficially, he died of dessert. Now let us not mock the man too harshly. There is something both deeply human and faintly comic in his passing. Who among us has not overindulged during a festival? Who has not, in a moment of joy or distraction, reached for just one more bite? And yet there is a particular poignancy in the way his life ended, not on a battlefield or in political exile, but surrounded by porcelain dishes and the scent of sweetened cream. Historians have often glossed over Adolf Frederick's rule, calling him a weak monarch with little influence. But perhaps that is precisely why his death holds such strange appeal. He was not a tyrant, not a warmonger, not a schemer in backlit halls. He was a man with a fondness for fine dining and a fatal flaw for fluffy pastries, and while his political legacy may have crumbled like puff pastry in the mouth of history, his culinary demise has proven oddly enduring. Each February in Sweden, as Shrove Tuesday arrives once again, bakeries brim with semlor. Children peer through frosty windows, pointing. Excitedly, families gather, spoons in hand, cream on their lips, and someone inevitably retells the tale of the king who ate too much. It has become less a tragedy and more a bedtime story with butter. And so, dear listener, as you nestle into the warmth of your pillow and drift toward dreams scented faintly of cardamom and almond, consider the life of Adolf Frederick, not the crown or the courtly protocol, but the man who found joy in his meals and whose final moment was one of indulgence. In the quiet night, where the only sound is your breath and the memory of laughter, let us leave the king at his table, full, content and gently snoring beside a silver fork, a final feast, a royal mistake, and a story sweet enough to remember. There are certain names in history that arrive like a sigh, soft, dramatic, and vaguely perfumed with melancholy. Lord Byron is one of those names. A poet, a wanderer, a romantic with a limp and a legacy, he lived as if he were writing one long, tragic verse. And when death came, it did not do so with fanfare or thunder. It came quietly, in a foreign land, under gray skies and the slow rhythm of fever. George Gordon Byron, the 6th Baron Byron, was born into British nobility in 1788. But from the beginning, he was anything but conventional. He was born with a clubfoot, a detail that might have softened a lesser man. But Byron, with a heart as grand as the mountains he loved to climb, carried it like a quirk rather than a burden. His charisma was legendary, his scandals more so. By the time he was 24, he had published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a poem that made him an overnight celebrity. He once remarked, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous," and indeed he had. London society buzzed with tales of his beauty, his brilliance, and his dangerous liaisons. He became, quite unwillingly, the original bad boy of poetry, but fame sat uncomfortably on his shoulders. Byron, ever the restless soul, left England in 1816, never to return. Some said it was due to scandal, his rumored affair with his half-sister among the whispers, but others believe he simply grew tired of the polite hypocrisies of aristocratic life. He wandered across Europe like a ghost in velvet, writing as he went, his verses soaked with longing and landscape. In Italy, he joined political rebels. In Switzerland, he floated on Lake Geneva with Mary Shelley and ghost stories. And in Greece, he found something he had long searched for, cause. Greece, at the time, was struggling to break free from centuries of Ottoman rule. The war for independence had begun, and though Byron had never been a soldier, he threw himself into the revolution with the zeal of a man seeking redemption. He arrived in Missolonghi in 1824, bringing not only money but morale. He raised funds, commissioned ships, trained troops, and offered his fame like a banner. To the Greeks, he was not just a poet, he was a symbol, a foreign nobleman who cared deeply, irrationally, beautifully. But war is not poetic, and the swamps around Missolonghi did not care for verses or intentions. Byron fell ill. Some say it began with a chill from a rain-soaked ride. Others point to the marshy climate, breeding ground for malarial fevers and lingering infections. What is certain is that he refused medical treatment when it first appeared, a choice born perhaps of stubbornness or fear of bleeding, which was a common and often fatal practice at the time. By the time he allowed doctors to intervene, it was too late. He died on April 19, 1824. He was 36 years old. No last poem. No dramatic goodbye. Just a slow, burning fever and a heart that finally stopped. In the end, it was not war or scandal that took Lord Byron. It was the quiet cruelty of illness in a foreign bed, far from the green hills of England. The Greeks mourned him as a hero. Bells tolled. Streets were draped in black. His heart, quite literally, was removed and buried in Missolonghi. The rest of his body was shipped back to Britain, though not to Westminster Abbey, where he might have expected to lie among the poets. It would take over a century before the British establishment forgave him enough to place a memorial there. So what remains of Lord Byron? A tangled legacy of poetry and passion. A myth draped in velvet. A man who believed deeply in freedom and beauty, and who burned, briefly and brilliantly, through the landscape of 19th century Europe. Tonight, as you lie still and the world grows distant, think of Byron, not the scandal, not the fame, but the soul who once stood beneath Greek stars, dreaming of liberty and verses. Think of the poet who loved fiercely, wrote endlessly, and died quietly, not in glory but in sincerity. For some lives are not meant to last long. They flicker like candlelight against marble walls, soft, golden, and unforgettable. In the golden dusk of the early 20th century, before the world fully surrendered to modernity and skyscrapers, there danced a woman who defied all that was stiff and expected. She moved not with the precision of ballerinas, but like seaweed in a gentle tide, fluid, free, and utterly unconcerned with applause. Her name was Isadora Duncan, and her death, as it happened, would be as dramatic, poetic, and unsettlingly elegant as the life she spent in bare feet and flowing scarves. Isadora was born in San Francisco in 1877, a place as wild in spirit as she would become. From a young age, she rebelled against the rigid conventions of classical ballet. Where others saw pointed toes and practiced pirouettes, she saw cages. She wanted something more elemental, movement that was natural, expressive, spiritual. So she invented her own way, inspired by ancient Greek art, the sway of trees and the rhythm of waves. She danced barefoot in loose tunics, her hair unbound, her body telling stories not through steps, but through emotion. She danced in halls, in gardens, in salons, wherever the space allowed her soul to stretch. Europe adored her. Paris swooned. Berlin applauded. Russia wept. She became a muse for artists, a symbol of modern femininity, and a woman so thoroughly herself that even time seemed reluctant to claim her. But life, like dance, is full of turning points. Isadora's personal life was a tapestry of great loves and greater losses. She had children, but tragedy shadowed them. Her 2 young children drowned in a car accident in 1913, their vehicle rolling into the Seine. The grief nearly ended her. But somehow, with the quiet strength of someone who had always danced through sorrow, she returned to the stage softer, deeper, and even more untamed. She married once to Russian poet Sergei Yesenin, a union as volatile as a summer storm. He did not speak English. She did not speak Russian. They argued in translation and drank in unison. The marriage lasted 2 years and ended in heartbreak, and eventually, his suicide. Yet Isadora remained unbroken. She continued to teach, to perform, to write her memoirs with theatrical flair and unapologetic honesty. She wrapped herself in silk, spoke of revolution, smoked cigarettes like prayers, and wore long, flowing scarves that trailed behind her like the remnants of dreams. And it is here, at the edge of elegance and tragedy, that our story must slow on. The night of September 14, 1927, Isadora was in Nice, France. She was 50, still commanding attention wherever she went. That evening, she was in high spirits, reportedly calling out to friends that she was off for a glorious drive. She wore one of her signature scarves, a long, bright red silk number that fluttered behind her like a ribbon of flame. She climbed into the passenger seat of a convertible sports car, an Amilcar CGSS, driven by a handsome mechanic named Benoit Falchetto. The wind was cool, the night fresh with possibility. She leaned back, the scarf trailing over the side of the car like a dancer's arm lingering in a final pose. And then, fate, quiet, swift, and impossibly cruel, intervened. As the car accelerated along the Promenade des Anglais, the end of her scarf caught in the rear wheel axle. In a blink, it yanked tightly, pulling her backwards with a suddenness so sharp, so complete, that her neck was broken instantly. She died there in the car, her body limp, the scarf still wrapped like an echo around her throat. News spread quickly. The world gasped. A poet of movement, gone in a mechanical snap. Newspapers, never ones to resist a dramatic ending, played up the symbolism. Dancer of wind slain by air, some wrote. Others described her as strangled by her art. But perhaps the most haunting truth was this: she died exactly as she lived, in motion, in silk, and without apology. To some, her death seemed absurd. To others, inevitable. A woman so untethered, so vividly alive, could never have faded quietly. It had to be sudden, strange, and laced with a certain theatricality. But let us not remember Isadora for the ending alone. Let us remember the way she taught the world to see the body not as a tool of technique, but as an instrument of feeling. The way she stood barefoot on marble steps, arms outstretched to the sun. The way she defied convention not out of rebellion, but because convention simply didn't fit. Her legacy flows through the fabric of modern dance. Every leap that breaks form, every twirl that spills off stage, every choreographer who listens to the soul before the score, they owe something to Isadora. And tonight, as the wind brushes past your window and the world grows hushed, think of her one last time. Picture the soft rustle of silk, the slow arc of a dancer's arm, and a scarf carried gently into the night. For some spirits move too freely to be contained, and when they go, they leave behind the whisper of motion itself. In the frost-laced twilight of 19th century St. Petersburg, where carriages rolled like whispers over snow and candles flickered against heavy velvet curtains, there lived a poet who was as fiery in spirit as the Russian winters were cold. His name was Alexander Pushkin. To Russia, Pushkin was not just a writer. He was the writer, the father of modern Russian literature, a man who took a language dense with bureaucracy and folklore and made it sing. But for all his literary brilliance, it was not ink or quill that claimed his life. It was a pistol in a duel. Over honor, as absurd and devastating as that may sound. Let us begin not with his death but with the rhythm of his life. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin was born in 1799 to a noble family. He was descended from African royalty on his mother's side. His great-grandfather was Abram Petrovich Ganable, an African who had been brought to Russia and educated under Peter the Great. This legacy, both proud and complex, lingered in Pushkin's identity and subtly colored his verses. From a young age, Pushkin was a literary prodigy. He wrote with the fire of a romantic and the discipline of a scholar. His works danced between satire and sorrow, filled with duels, exiles, and characters that spoke in cadence to the Russian soul. His pen-shaped poetry, drama, and prose. Eugene Onegin, The Bronze Horseman, The Queen of Spades, each work a brushstroke in the great canvas of Russian identity. He wrote not from an ivory tower but from life itself, observing the court, the countryside, the cruel ironies of empire. And yet, for all his intellectual depth, Pushkin was also a man of passion. He was impulsive, proud, and dangerously quick to defend his honor. And that, dear listener, is where our path begins to narrow. Pushkin married Natalia Goncharova in 1831, a beauty of St. Petersburg society, whose grace turned heads and whispered gossip. She was young, barely 17, and Pushkin adored her with the intensity of a man always fearing the next turn of fate. But beauty in court often draws the eyes of others, and one such admirer was Georges Dantes, a French officer with charm, as polished as his uniform. Rumors began to swirl, quiet at first, then louder like wind before a storm. Notes were exchanged, anonymous letters. Some claimed Dantes was courting Natalia. Others said it was a plot to provoke Pushkin. It worked. By January 1837, the whispers had become unbearable. Pushkin, wounded in pride and spirit, challenged Dantes to a duel. It was not his first. He had already faced nearly 30 challenges in his lifetime. But this would be his last. On the icy afternoon of January 27, 1837, the two men met at the Black River, a quiet place just outside the city's bustle. Snow muffled the world. No fanfare, no audience, just seconds, silence, and the ritual of destruction. Pushkin fired first. He wounded Dantes in the arm. But the Frenchman's bullet struck Pushkin in the abdomen, tearing through his body and shattering his pelvis. He collapsed, carried home. And there, in his apartment on the Moika River, he lingered in agony for 2 days. Doctors came and went. Morphine dulled the pain but could not slow the bleeding. Pushkin, ever the poet, dictated letters. He made peace with friends. He kissed his wife's hand and asked her not to weep. Then, quietly, he slipped away. He was 37 years old. Russia wept. The Tsar declared national mourning, schools closed, streets filled with mourners. And yet his funeral was restricted. No grand procession, no civic display. The government feared his popularity might stir unrest, so they buried him quietly, far from the capital, beneath snow and history. But Pushkin would not remain silent. His works endured, studied in every Russian school, quoted at every toast, whispered between lovers, and shouted in protest. His influence shaped generations of writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Akhmatova, and continues to echo even now, wherever Russian is spoken and sorrow sung. And what of the duel? Did it settle anything? Prove anything? No, Dantes was merely wounded, later exiled, and lived a long, uneventful life in France. Pushkin, the man of fire and ink, was reduced to silence by a moment of pride. It was, as many said later, the most senseless death in Russian literary history. Yet somehow, it feels fitting. Pushkin's life was a duel, with authority, with identity, with the rules of writing and the roles of men. That it ended in a pistol's echo in snow feels not just tragic but eerily poetic. And tonight, as you lie in the stillness of your room, with the hush of evening pressing gently on the glass, think of Pushkin, not the gun, not the gossip, but the man who taught a language to feel, Imagine the soft scratch of his quill, the curve of a comma, the breath between lines, and perhaps, as sleep begins to wrap around you, you'll hear it, the snow falling outside St. Petersburg, covering the past one silent flake at a time. Long before the whispers of medieval courts or the clinking of knightly armor, the world bowed beneath the grandeur and cruelty of Rome. Its emperors were not merely rulers, they were avatars of divine will, or at least they liked to think so. But history, with its sharp sense of irony, often humbles the mighty in the most unexpected ways. And no tale illustrates that more grimly, or dramatically, than the fate of Emperor Valerian. Valerian ruled Rome during the 3rd century CE ADRE, time often referred to by historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, a cheerful name for a very chaotic period. The empire was under siege, politically unstable, militarily stretched thin, and economically, let's say creatively deteriorating. In the midst of this turmoil, Valerian rose to power in 253 CE. He was a soldier emperor, pragmatic, loyal, and likely exhausted from the constant juggling act of border wars, rebellious generals, and inflation that made a loaf of bread cost roughly the same as a small palace. But the real trouble would come not from within, but from the east. There, in the vast Persian lands ruled by the Sasanian Empire, sat King Shapur Thumr, charismatic, cunning, and determined to remind Rome that it did not own the world. In 260 CE, Valerian led a campaign to push back against Shapur's incursions in modern-day Syria. He marched east with an army, aged but resolute, believing perhaps that one decisive victory would stabilize the empire. Instead, it all fell apart. Q. The Battle of Edessa. The Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat. Thousands were killed. And Valerian, yes, the emperor himself, was captured, alive. It was the first time in Roman history that a reigning emperor had been taken prisoner by a foreign power. It was, by all measures, an unspeakable humiliation. Rome, the eternal city, the seat of gods, had its sovereign bound like any other man, and what followed is where fact begins to wrestle with legend. According to Roman sources, especially Lactantius, a Christian writer with a flair for moralizing, Valerian's captivity was nothing short of a living nightmare. Shapur, it said, treated the emperor not as a guest or even as a prisoner, but as a trophy. A footstool, literally. When Shapur mounted his horse, Valerian was reportedly forced to kneel and serve as a human stepping stool. Day after day, the once great emperor bowed beneath the boots of a foreign king. Not merely defeated, debased, but the final act was even darker. Lactantius claims that after years of humiliation, Shapur decided to make a spectacle of his power. He had Valerian flayed alive, his skin carefully removed and stuffed with straw or hay, then displayed in a temple as a warning to Rome and a victory monument for Persia. Whether this exact fate is historically accurate remains a matter of debate. Persian records, unsurprisingly, make no mention of flaying and instead suggest Valerian lived out his days in relatively humane captivity, perhaps even helping build infrastructure for the Sasanian state. But even if the crueler version of events was propaganda, it struck a chord because it felt fitting in the mythic architecture of Rome's rise and fall. A reminder that no man, no emperor, is immune to the turning tide. So what lessons lie in the folds of this unsettling tale? Is it a warning against pride? A meditation on imperial fragility? Or just an ancient example of how far political humiliation can be stretched, sometimes quite literally? For Rome, Valerian's fate was a shockwave. His son Gallienus ruled alone thereafter, and the empire continued to fracture. But for historians and storytellers, his end became a parable of power lost, of dignity shattered, and of how even the mightiest can be reduced to furniture. And yet in the quiet stillness of reflection, there is a strange kind of poetry in Valerian's fall. He was not killed in battle, not poisoned in a feast, not overthrown by conspirators. He was taken alive, held, displayed. He became a living metaphor for an empire on its knees, still wearing its crown, but unable to stand. Tonight, as you settle into your own quiet world, soft sheets, warm silence, perhaps a faint hum of wind beyond the window, think of Valerian, not with pity but with a kind of awe. For here was a man who ruled the greatest empire of his time, and ended as a footnote to someone else's triumph. His story reminds us how quickly history can shift, how power is a cloak sewn with threads of sand, and how sometimes the strangest deaths leave the deepest impressions. Now close your eyes, and let the noise of empire fade. Let the sound of sandals on marble and war cries on desert winds soften. Let the strange silence of defeat echo not as shame, but as a moment to exhale. Even emperors, after all, must one day rest. In the closing decades of the 19th century, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood grand and fragile like a porcelain tea set on the edge of a shelf, there lived a prince named Rudolf. He was the heir to an empire, the future of a dynasty, and a soul far too modern for the world into which he was born. His death would shake Europe, but not with cannons or revolutions. It came softly, like the crack of something delicate, and the world in that moment was left staring at the shell, wondering what had truly broken inside. Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, as she was known in whispers and poetry. Born in 1858, Rudolf was raised in the cold corridors of the Habsburg court, where smiles were measured and footsteps echoed like laws. He was expected to rule, to lead, to inherit the empire that had survived centuries, sewn together by marriage, conquest, and compromise. But from the beginning, Rudolf chafed beneath that weight. He was not his father, stern and orderly, nor his mother, ethereal and elusive. Rudolf was intellectual, sensitive, curious. He read Darwin and Shakespeare, questioned Catholic doctrine, sympathized with liberal causes, and longed quietly, terribly, for something more than ceremony. To those who knew him, Rudolf was like a man out of time. He wandered through the marble halls of Vienna with eyes full of melancholy, a cigarette in one hand and in the other, always, an idea too dangerous to say aloud. And then there was Mayerling. Let us pause for a moment on that name. Mayerling. A quiet hunting lodge tucked among the woods of Lower Austria. Snowy, secluded, serene. It sounds like the name of a fairy tale hamlet, and in some ways it became one, but of the grim variety. In January 1889, Rudolf arrived at Mayerling with a young woman named Baroness Mary Wetzera. She was 17, he was 30, she was infatuated, he was unraveling. The official version of events, declared by imperial decree, was simple: a murder-suicide. Rudolf, in a fit of despair, had shot Mary and then himself. But the simplicity of that version would never satisfy a curious world. Rumors bloomed like frost on glass. Some claimed it was a political assassination. Rudolf had plotted to overthrow his father and reform the empire, and someone silenced him. Others whispered of family intervention, a cover-up to protect royal reputation. Still others insisted it was a suicide pact, a tragic union between two souls unable to live within the confines of their world. The truth, like so many royal secrets, was wrapped in silence, contradiction, and the scent of roses left too long in the vase. What is known is this: Rudolf was deeply unhappy. He had long suffered from depression, was estranged from his wife, and reportedly addicted to morphine. His letters from that period read like the scribbled margins of a sad play, full of longing, regret, and resignation. Mary, too, left behind notes. Her writing was romantic, dramatic, and eerily calm. "We are both going into the unknown," she wrote, "where we shall find peace." They were found on the morning of January 30th, their bodies lifeless, the room cold. The pistol lay near Rudolf's hand. The empire trembled. Rudolf's death caused a succession crisis. The next heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would later be assassinated in Sarajevo, sparking World War I. In a strange way, the quiet shot fired at Meyerling echoed louder through history than most cannon blasts. And yet, beyond the politics and speculation, there remains the human story. A prince who read poetry and hated uniforms, a girl who loved him, a winter lodge, and the unbearable weight of expectations wrapped around the heart like velvet chains. Rudolf never wanted to be emperor. He wanted to be understood. But the Habsburg court, with its brocade, protocols, and invisible prisons, did not understand men like Rudolf. It wanted certainty, not complexity, order, not doubt. And so, like many before and after, Rudolf disappeared into the space between the world he was born into and the one he wished existed. Today, Meyerling is a Carmelite convent. The room where they died has been turned into a chapel. Prayers rise, where once silence fell, and the walls, if they remember, do so without speaking. But on certain cold nights, if you listen closely, you might hear it, the soft whisper of footsteps in snow, the creak of a door that should not open, and two hearts beating briefly against the inevitability of history. And so, dear listener, as the hush of night gathers gently around your pillow, think of Rudolf, not the title, not the mystery, but the boy who once looked out at the Alps and dreamed of something more. Let his name pass through you like a sigh, mournful, but never bitter. For in the end, his story is not about royalty, but about fragility. A delicate egg held too tightly by a hand that did not know how to be gentle. In the farthest reaches of the earth, where the sky glows with a light both blue and blinding, where snow whispers secrets that no one is meant to hear, a man once walked through the white silence chasing the idea of glory. His name was Robert Falcon Scott, and the end of his story is not a moment, but a slow fading like a candle guttering in the vast cold breath of the Antarctic. Scott was born in 1868 in Devon, England, beside warmer seas, softer winds. From an early age he was drawn to the ocean, joining the Royal Navy at 13. But it wasn't the battles that called to him. It was the blank spaces on the map. At the turn of the 20th century, exploration was still a kind of heroism. World had mostly been claimed, but the poles, those strange, shimmering boundaries, remained unconquered. They were the last dragons. Scott led his first Antarctic expedition in 1901, the Discovery Expedition, which taught him the harsh lessons of the ice. He returned a national hero, but he had unfinished business. In 1910, he set out again, this time with a singular goal, to be the first man to reach the South Pole. The expedition was grandly named the Terra Nova, New Land. It was a curious blend of Victorian tradition and brave modernity. They brought ponies, dogs, motor sledges, and a spirit of scientific curiosity. They carried books, musical instruments, and tins of plum pudding. They marched into the most unforgiving climate on Earth with wool, whiskey, and optimism. Scott and his men began the final push to the pole in late 1911. The landscape stretched out before them, white, endless, deceptively calm. Each step was a negotiation with frostbite. Each breath stung the lungs like needles. But they pressed on. Through snowdrifts and frozen winds, past glaciers with names like dreams, Beardmore, Ross, Erebus, and then, on January 17th, 1912, after weeks of bone-deep cold and staggering exhaustion, they saw it. A flag, a Norwegian flag. Roald Amundsen, their rival, had beaten them to the South Pole by 34 days. The disappointment was heavy, not just professional, but spiritual. Scott wrote in his diary, "The worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place." Still, they turned back with dignity, dragging their sledges, heads bowed but unbroken. But the return journey would be far crueler than the advance. The weather worsened. Supplies dwindled. One man, Edgar Evans, began to lose coordination, likely a concussion from a fall. He died in February. Then Lawrence Oates, suffering from frostbite so severe he could barely walk, did something remarkable. One morning he stepped out of the tent into a blizzard, saying quietly, "I'm just going outside and maybe sometime." He never returned. Scott recorded it with gentle awe. "We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death. It was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. But the storm did not abate. Scott, along with Edward Wilson and Henry Bowers, was now trapped just 11 miles from a supply depot. The tent flapped against the white fury outside. The cold bit deeper. The ink in his pen froze between sentences. Still he wrote, final letters to his wife, his country, his friends, pages of reflection, regret, and acceptance. On March 29, 1912, his diary ends. "For God's sake, look after our people." The world wouldn't learn their fate until the following spring, when a search party found their tent, collapsed half buried in snow. Inside were the three men lying close as if in conversation. Scott was in the middle. Beside them, carefully stacked, were their journals, photographs, and specimens, collected even in their last days. They had died not just as explorers, but as scientists, seekers, and quiet poets of frost. News of their death stunned the world. They became heroes, memorialized in bronze and marble. Schools were named after them, streets, ships. But over time, their story softened, not just as a tale of tragedy, but of endurance, dignity, and the human spirit pressing against the limits of the known. And what of the South Pole? It still stands indifferent. A place of stillness and sky, where the wind has no memory and the snow buries all ambition. But in that great silence, something of Scott remains. Not in the conquest, but in the attempt. Not in triumph, but in the resolve to walk through the storm, even knowing it may not part. So tonight, as your room fills with shadows and your thoughts drift like flakes on wind, think of the sailor who chased the edge of the world. Picture a canvas tent, lit dimly by a lantern, and three men writing with stiff hands, still dreaming of the sea. And let that vision carry you into sleep, not with sadness, but with a kind of reverence. For some journeys don't end in arrival. They end in the stories we leave behind. In the frost-bitten corridors of Imperial Russia, where chandeliers trembled beneath the weight of secrets and czarinas whispered to saints in candlelit chapels, one figure moved like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to ignore. His name was Grigory Rasputin, monk, mystic, madman, or savior, depending on whom you asked. He wore rags beneath furs, carried both prayer and scandal in his beard, and walked uninvited through the palace of the Romanovs like a ghost that refused to leave. And the night he died was a story so strange, it feels like something dreamed, in fever. Rasputin was born a peasant in Siberia, in the cold belly of Russia. He received no formal education, but by some crooked path, vision, charisma, and a certain unshakable gaze, he made his way to St. Petersburg and into the very heart of the empire. The Romanovs were desperate. Their only son, Alexei, heir to the throne, suffered from hemophilia, a disease that turned even the smallest bruise into a death threat. Doctors failed. Priests offered little comfort. But Rasputin, with his whispered prayers and hypnotic calm, seemed to help. When Alexei bled, Rasputin's presence quieted the agony. Empress Alexandra clung to him as to a lifeline. To her, he was holy. To others, he was a parasite in peasants' robes. His influence grew unchecked. Appointments were made at his suggestion. Policies were bent to his muttered opinions. And rumors, dark, endless, half-true, spread like fire in the tapestries. He drank. He caroused. He laid hands too freely. He claimed visions. He claimed divine favor. The court seethed. The nobles plotted. And in December of 1916, as the empire itself teetered toward collapse, they decided he must die. The plan was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's richest families. He was young, handsome, decadent, a man who threw parties with peacocks and dined beneath ceilings painted with angels. But that winter, he set his sights on darker arrangements. He invited Rasputin to the Moika Palace on the night of December 29th. The excuse? A gathering, drinks, music, perhaps a favor. Rasputin came willingly, unarmed, unguarded. He trusted Felix. Or perhaps he didn't care. They led him downstairs to a basement room, dimly lit, chilled by the outside snow. A feast awaited him. Cakes, wine, roast meats, and laced in it all, cyanide. Enough to kill a dozen men. Rasputin ate. He drank, he laughed. Time passed, but he did not die. Felix grew nervous. He excused himself. Upstairs, his co-conspirators waited, pacing on Persian carpets. "He's not dead," Felix whispered. "Impossible." They handed him a revolver. Felix returned to the basement, trembling. He raised the gun and fired. Rasputin fell. Breathing ceased, or so it seemed. The prince ran upstairs, triumphant, declaring the deed done. They celebrated quietly. Champagne was likely poured. But then, a sound. Footsteps. Below, they rushed back down. Rasputin was moving, not crawling, standing. His eyes wild, unfocused. He lunged at Felix, stumbled into the snow, tried to flee. Another shot was fired. And another. Still he gasped. Still he clawed at the air. Finally he was shot in the head. They bound his limbs, wrapped his body in a carpet, and fearing he might somehow yet rise, they threw him into the frozen Neva River. When his body was found days later, his lungs contained water, meaning he had been alive when they submerged him, or so the story goes. Historians argue. Perhaps the poison failed. Perhaps the story was exaggerated later, twisted into legend by fear and fascination. Perhaps he died quickly and the rest was theater. But even stripped of embellishment, the core remains chilling. He died not once, but again and again, killed in rumor, in firelight tales, in the mutterings of courtiers who swore they'd seen him in their dreams. Rasputin became more than man. He became myth. And yet, beneath the beard, the miracles, the whispers, he was something far more human. A father, a husband, a man who believed, however strangely, in divine connection. Was he a monster, a martyr, a charlatan, or a misunderstood mystic? Perhaps in the end he was all and none. Tonight, as the snow drifts beyond your window and the wind plays soft music through bare trees, imagine that last feast. A flickering candle, a glass of poisoned wine untouched by fate, a man seated calmly at a table set for treachery. And listen, not for footsteps, but for silence. For Rasputin's death was not the end of anything. Russia would fall just months later. The Romanovs would perish. The empire he haunted would melt into blood and revolution. He was not the disease. He was the symptom, and like all symptoms, he passed, leaving behind the ache of something greater, collapsing. Now sleep gently under heavier blankets than Rasputin ever knew. Let the cold remain outside, and the strangeness of his tale soften into shadow. For even in the darkest corners of history, there are stories that linger like smoke. And Rasputin somehow is always still walking. Once he strode across Europe like thunder. He rewrote borders with a nod, crowned himself emperor with both defiance and flair, and left a trail of cannon smoke and civic codes in his wake. But Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who dreamed in maps and marched in strategy, ended not with a charge of cavalry but with a pen, and the long sigh of waves breaking on a lonely island. His final days were spent not on the battlefield, but in exile, on St. Helena, a speck of volcanic rock adrift in the South Atlantic, where clouds hovered like grudges and ships passed like ghosts, never stopping. Let us begin not with the fall, but with the climb. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon rose quickly, first as a general of rare brilliance, then as first consul, and finally self-declared emperor of the French. He was not born into greatness, he seized it. His victories were staggering. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. His empire stretched from Lisbon to Warsaw. He gave Europe a new rhythm, brief, intoxicating, and terrifying, but even meteors fall. By 1815, after years of war, coalitions, and growing resistance, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Not decisively, perhaps, but symbolically. The dream of empire cracked. He surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy, or at least proximity to home. Instead, they sent him far away. Farther than Elba, farther than hope. To St. Helena, a rock in the ocean, windy, isolated, unyielding, a place where even ambition must sit down. Napoleon arrived in October of 1815. He brought with him a small entourage, loyal generals, a doctor, a steward or two. They were allowed to remain, to serve him in exile. But his world had shrunk. No more court, no more armies, just clouds and routine. His residence was Longwood House, a drafty, unimpressive structure surrounded by fog and suspicion. British guards watched him always. He was not treated as a prisoner per se, but he was certainly not free. And yet even there he tried to build an empire of sorts. He established a daily schedule. Woke late, rode briefly when weather allowed, dictated memoirs to secretaries who scribbled beneath his breath. He paced. He spoke of Austerlitz, of Caesar, of destiny. He corrected history as he went, painting himself not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood liberator. He wrote constantly. And in that writing there is something almost tender. Napoleon, without cannon or crown, becoming a narrator of his own myth. But the island had other plans. The climate wore on him. The food, salty, limited, uninspired, did little to soothe his ailments. He complained of liver pain, nausea, fatigue. His doctor disagreed with his diagnosis. Napoleon argued, switched diets, tried exercise. Nothing helped. By 1821, his health was failing visibly. He could no longer ride. He dictated less, sighed more. He asked often for his son, the boy once called the King of Rome, now living in exile himself. The boy never came. On May 5th, after months of pain and declining strength, Napoleon Bonaparte died. No fanfare, no soldiers saluting, no final charge. Just a small room, a narrow bed, a handful of loyalists, and the endless sound of wind. He was 51. The official cause of death was listed as stomach cancer. Others whispered of poisoning, arsenic perhaps, slipped slowly over time. Autopsies were inconclusive. Conspiracies, of course, grew like ivy on stone. His last words were said to be France the army, the head of the army, Josephine, a list of what he had loved, what he had lost, and what he still held in his mind as the end approached. They buried him on the island, a plain tomb. No name on the stone, just the initials N. His enemies feared that a grander monument might inspire pilgrimage. But time, as always, moves on. In 1840, his body was returned to France. The procession through Paris was thunderous. Crowds wept. Cannons roared. He was laid to rest beneath the dome of Les Invalides, in a tomb so grand it might have embarrassed even him. Yet perhaps it was fitting. For the man who had once ruled so much, who was once feared and adored in equal measure, died as all men do. Quietly, without armies, without titles. Just a man, remembering, regretting, and releasing. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think not of the emperor, the conqueror, the name carved on 100 monuments. Think of the man alone on an island, with ink-stained fingers, with a memory of snow at Austerlitz and the scent of Josephine's perfume. A man who rewrote Europe, and then rewrote himself. There is something oddly peaceful in the idea that even the stormiest life must end in stillness, that even the loudest march fades into sea foam. Let the waves carry you now, gently, quietly, past the coastlines of history, toward dreams of distant islands where even ambition at last must sleep. There are men who die with the world cheering, and there are men who die after changing it. only to find that the applause has long faded. Simón Bolívar was the second kind. Known across continents as El Libertador, Bolívar freed nations, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia all bore the mark of his leadership. But in the final chapter of his life, it was not the roar of cannons that surrounded him, but the soft rustle of mango leaves. He died not as a president or a warrior, but as an exile in his own land. Bolívar was born in Caracas in 1783 into wealth. He had titles, inheritance, and education. But early tragedy, losing both parents young, combined with European travels, planted something deeper in him, a hunger for purpose. He studied revolution in Paris, watched Napoleon crown himself, dreamed of a South America free from Spanish chains, and unlike most who dream, he acted. Between 1810 and 1825, Bolívar became the architect of liberation. He crossed the Andes with an army, one of the most daring military feats in history. He fought more battles than he could recount. He led, failed, returned, and triumphed. He was more than a general. He became a symbol, but symbols too can be shattered. Liberation is one thing, governing, quite another. Bolívar longed for unity, a grand republic stretching across northern South America, a united Gran Colombia. But the dream was larger than the loyalty of men. Factions split. Rivals emerged. Corruption crept in. Bolívar, weary and idealistic to the last, declared, "Those who serve the revolution plow the sea." By 1830, his authority had waned. His health was failing. Tuberculosis, the slow assassin of so many in history, was tightening its grip. He resigned the presidency. He prepared to leave for exile in Europe. He never made it. Instead, he stopped in Santa Marta, along Colombia's northern coast. There, in the humid, lush estate of Quinta de San Pedro Alejandrino, Bolívar lived out his final weeks. The house was quiet, shaded by mango trees. The once mighty liberator slept in a borrowed bed. He had little money, no uniform, and only a few loyal companions. Gone were the battalions. Gone were the parades. And yet, even in frailty, he remained dignified. He still wrote, still read. He dictated letters to friends and to the new government, urging unity, pleading for an end to civil strife. But his words, like his body, were fading. On December 17, 1830, Simón Bolívar died at age 47. His final words, according to his doctor, were quiet. "How will I ever get out of this labyrinth?" It's uncertain if he meant death, politics, or life itself. Perhaps all three. There was no grand funeral, no orchestral requiem. He was buried hastily in a modest grave nearby. The heat of the tropics gave little time for reflection. Later, his remains would be moved, first to Caracas, then to a monumental tomb. Statues would be built, cities named, his face carved onto currency and memory. But in that moment, there was only stillness, and the sound of mango leaves trembling in the wind. So what do we make of this ending? A man who freed nations but died nearly forgotten? A visionary undone by the very freedom he gave others? Or perhaps Bolívar's final legacy lies not in power retained, but in power relinquished. He did not cling. He did not beg. He stepped away, quietly, leaving behind an unfinished map, a half-sung anthem. History is often written in blood and marble, but Bolívar's end reminds us that greatness can flicker, not explode. That sometimes the most enduring fires burn not on battlefields, but in the breath of memory, soft, warm, persistent. So tonight, as your breath slows and the day folds in on itself, think of that distant estate near the Caribbean. Picture a veranda, a worn chair, a figure wrapped in linen watching the sunset through the branches of a mango tree. Let the rustling leaves be your lullaby. Let Bolívar, at last, sleep in peace, not as a general or a myth, but as a man who gave everything for an idea and died under its weight. There are those who live their lives like thunder, loud, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. And then there are those who are the lightning, brilliant, brief, and always just a little too far ahead of their time. Nikola Tesla was the lightning. Born during a midnight storm in July of 1856 in a village nestled within the Austrian Empire, now Croatia, the midwife reportedly declared his arrival an omen. Lightning cracked the sky as he emerged, and his mother whispered, "He will be a child of light." She wasn't wrong. Tesla would go on to illuminate the world in ways no one had imagined, only to die in darkness, alone, in a small room with more pigeons than people for company. But let us rewind to where the currents first sparked. From a young age, Tesla saw patterns in everything. He claimed to visualize inventions fully before ever touching a tool. His mind was an electric loom, weaving possibilities faster than society could stitch them into the fabric of daily life. He moved to the United States in 1884, carrying little more than a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison and a head full of ideas. Their relationship began with promise and ended in rivalry. Edison, pragmatic and profit-driven, championed direct current, DC, as the future of electricity. Tesla, more idealistic, believed in alternating current, AC, faster, cleaner, able to travel longer distances. Their war of the currents was more than a technical debate. It was a clash of worldviews. Tesla won, in a sense. His AC system became the standard. His polyphase motor powered the modern world. He harnessed Niagara Falls, turned physics into poetry, and whispered theories that would take decades to catch up with. He dreamed not of wealth, but of free energy, broadcast wirelessly, available to all. He saw the planet as a conductor, the human brain as a receiver, and the future as a glowing lattice of wireless communication and automation. In 1899, he moved to Colorado Springs to experiment with wireless transmission. There he built a massive coil, sending bolts of artificial lightning into the sky. Townsfolk reported flickering lights and crackling fences miles away. Tesla stood amid it all, arms outstretched, like a prophet calling down the storm. He returned to New York, buoyed by discovery. But the world, as always, demanded results it could hold in its hand. Or bank J.P. Morgan, who had funded Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, grew impatient. Investors faded, patents were stolen, credit lost. While others monetized electricity, Tesla retreated deeper into theory. He spoke of death rays, interplanetary communication, and invisible forces. Newspapers began to call him eccentric, then mad, then nothing at all. By the 1920s, Tesla lived in hotels, drifting between rooms, often unable to pay. He fed pigeons in the park and claimed one white dove visited him daily. "I loved that pigeon," he once said, "as a man loves a woman." He dined alone, often on a strict diet of milk and honey. He avoided physical contact, obsessed over the number 3, and continued writing. Pages and pages of formulas, letters, and diagrams no one would see. Still, he invented the remote control, fluorescent lighting, the foundation of radar, the principles of wireless data transmission. All were sketched in his mind, many built with his own hands. But recognition faded. Awards were scarce. Royalties rarer. By the 1930s, he was an odd footnote to a new, noisier age. Radios hummed, airplanes roared, and cities blazed with light, much of it powered by the systems he had imagined. But his name was a whisper. In January 1943, alone, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, Tesla died in his sleep. The official cause was coronary thrombosis. He was 86. When his body was discovered, his papers vanished under orders from the U.S. government. Some say they feared what secrets might lie within. Others suspect there was nothing left but dreams and equations. He left no wife, no children, no fortune. Just a trail of sparks that would take nearly a century to ignite fully. Today, his legacy has revived. Tesla coils crackle in science museums. His name graces electric cars. Books and documentaries speak of his genius. His face appears on statues, currencies, and internet memes. But perhaps the truest tribute is this. Every time a current flows through a wire, every time a device charges, every time invisible energy moves quietly from one place to another, we are walking in the wake of Tesla's thoughts. So tonight, as your lights dim and your mind begins to drift, imagine a tall man in a rumpled suit, standing beneath a tower of metal, listening to the storm. He's not thinking about money or fame. He's thinking about the shape of energy, about the way pigeons move when they fly, about the number 3. Let that image lull you into stillness. For some men are not made to last in time. They flash through it, too fast, too bright, and leave behind something quieter, something waiting in the dark to be discovered. Nikola Tesla was the lightning, and now, in the hush of your own room, the storm has passed. Rest with the gentle hum of electricity in the walls, a whisper from the man who once called down thunder with a flick of his hand. In the golden age of velvet curtains and gaslight theaters, there stood a man who made impossibility his profession. He slipped through chains, vanished from locked crates, and leapt from bridges with a grin and a stopwatch. His name was Harry Houdini. And when death came for him, it was not with a grand finale, not in water or fire, but quietly, from within, one last escape that he could not master. Born Erich Weiss in 1874 in Budapest, he arrived in America as a child, one of many, immigrants chasing breath and bread in a land of steel and possibility. His family settled in Wisconsin, and the boy who would become Houdini began his life poor, clever, and restless. He first found performance through circus acts, then slowly drifted toward what would define him, escape. His early acts were modest: card, tricks, rope escapes, handcuff challenges. But he understood something instinctively. Magic was not about deception. It was about tension, anticipation, the pause before release. And so he built a legend on the edge of breath. He escaped from locked milk cans filled with water, from sealed coffins, from straitjackets while dangling upside down from cranes. Crowds screamed, reporters scribbled, rivals gawked. Houdini didn't just escape physical bounds, he transcended fear itself. But behind the curtain, he was a man of control. He studied locks obsessively. He trained his body like an athlete. He rehearsed, rechecked, and repeated every motion until his bones remembered them better than he did. He despised frauds, especially spiritualists, those who claimed to speak with the dead. After his beloved mother passed in 1913, he sought comfort in seances, but found only trickery. He turned skeptic, became a crusader against false mediums, exposing them on stage and in print. And yet he made a pact. With his wife Bess, he promised that if there was any way to reach across the veil after death, he would find it. They agreed, on a code, an unbreakable series of words and signals. If he returned, they would know. He never did. But let's return now to that final October in 1926. Houdini was performing in Montreal. Between shows, he entertained students in his dressing room, speaking of endurance, magic, and his famed ability to absorb punches to the stomach. One student, unaware of the need for preparation, struck him hard without warning. Houdini smiled, winced, and carried on. Days later in Detroit, he performed again, fevered, sweating, in visible pain. After the show, he collapsed. He had a ruptured appendix. Peritonitis had set in. He refused treatment at first, denied weakness, but his body, like any locked box, had its limit. He died on October 31st, 1926, Halloween. The date felt too perfect, as if scripted by a ghostwriter. He was 52, and the world mourned. Magicians draped their tools in black. Theaters dimmed their lights. Audiences wept for a man who had spent his life vanishing, but had now truly disappeared. They buried him in Queens, beneath a grave marked with a broken wand, a magician's tribute. Thousands came. Bess, his wife and stage partner, stood quietly by, the code locked in her heart. Every Halloween for 10 years, she held a seance waiting for the signal. A tap, a word, a whisper. None came. Eventually, she stopped. 10 years is long enough to wait for any man, she said. But others continue the ritual. To this day, seances are held on Halloween in Houdini's name, just in case. And what do we make of him now? Houdini was more than escape. He was belief. The idea that, even when shackled, submerged, or buried, the human spirit might rise. That courage is not loud but breathless. That wonder, even in the age of reason, still has a place. He understood that magic was never about the trick. It was about the trust. We wanted him to escape. We needed him to escape. Because if he could survive the impossible, maybe we could, too. And yet, in the end, he did not. His final escape was no escape at all. Just a hospital bed, the slow clock of pain, and the soft fall of silence. So tonight, as the lights dim and your eyes begin to close, imagine a theater long empty, a stage where dust catches in the spotlight, a pair of handcuffs left unlocked on a stool, and somewhere beyond the veil a magician smiling, not because he's returned, but because you remembered to look. For the curtain may fall, the mirrors may cloud, but the echo of wonder never quite fades. Sleep now. The show is over. But the story, like all great illusions, lingers still.